So Steph and I were just talking through the base URL feature that we just added to Plenti. So basically, we have a lot of websites here that we're trying to build. So we're basing this off Hugo themes. So let me see, Hugo theme, Big Spring. I want to look up this real quick. Big Spring. One of the first themes that we did is we built this Big Spring theme out in Plenti. And if you look at these demo sites here, for instance, you notice that they are in these subfolders here on URLs. Now, Plenti didn't really have a good way to do that because you need to make all your links off here, like these relative links, work off this URL here, even though the website is based off the root of the thing. So in order to do that, we need to implement that new feature, base URL. Now, the way that we did this in Plenti is we wanted to hijack basically the base element, which is a standard HTML5 element, and you put that element into your head of your website. And what that does is it dictates the behavior for the links of that website. And there's three types of links that you would really need to worry about in a website. So there are absolute URLs that would look like this, mysite.com/about. And then there are relative URLs that would just be like putting the link about like this. And then there's root relative URLs like /about. Now, when you use a root relative URL, basically what it does is it allows you to work across different environments. So you might have a staging, a dev, and a production environment. And so you might have something like dev.mysite.com. .com. And then if you have root relative URLs across, you can, make sure like the about, and then this will work on this page here, but it'll also work on your staging site like STG, and it'll work on your production site, which is probably just mysite.com. And that's really great because you can use it across those different environments versus if you use an absolute URL, like if you hard-coded this URL each time, like HTTPS, like this, then anytime you're on your dev site and you clicked on a URL, it would take you back to the production site. So that's why root relative URLs are pretty cool, and I use those in a lot of different websites. But the problem with root relative URLs like this /about is they don't work with the base element, right? So if we come over here, let's look at our head here. So you can see we have this base element here, and the href right here is just the /. So we started adding this to all the Plenti sites to make sure these URLs work across sites. So if we had something like this, like a subfolder test that we wanted all our links to work off of, if we used absolute URLs, like so if we came over here and we look at this, so you can see here we have an about page. So this is a relative URL. There's no / here. So this will respect the base element up here that we looked at. So this would respect the test there, although this page is actually using the /, right? So when you hover over this, you'll see that down here in the bottom left-hand corner, you'll see that it actually goes to about. So that's working because it's based off this, but here you could change this to work with a subfolder. So this gives us a lot of power when we add this element here. So we can basically have like a production site that all our links work off of, and our local site, we can still work off of a /. So we need two basic components, right? We need to check to make sure whether we're on a local or a deployed site. And then if we're on a local site, we want to just use a / base URL. And if we're on a production site, then we might want to use a subfolder like, my theme or whatever. This is popular convention for something like GitHub pages or GitLab pages, which is a free hosting that integrates right with your repository. So we want to basically set that up to work with this. So there's a couple things we need to think about, right? So we want to convert all the URLs from root relative URLs. So right now we call out to all our style sheets. We mount our main JS and everything like that with root relative URLs. So we want to change that to be relative URLs, which is something I never used in the past. But when you use that in conjunction with a base element in your head, they will work very similar to root URLs. So you can either do off the / if you're on your local or your subfolder if you're off a different environment. So we went through and we changed all the starter information to basically use those relative URLs instead of root relative URLs. But we had a lot of things that we had to do to make sure that root relative URLs still work, because people are probably going to code their websites with root relative URLs still. So I basically had to come through here. If we look at some of the Plenti code, in our main JS, I started doing a lot of things where I changed our content lookup function here. Now this is part of the main JS. This is usually in the core of Plenti. So this is something you would have to eject to actually go and edit in your Plenti site. You don't have to worry about this most of the time. But we also have new function in here. So we have a function that makes URLs relative. So if people are using root relatives or absolute URLs, actually this would only work with root relative. It won't change your absolute URLs. Those should just come through as normal. But basically what comes in here is we go through and we say, is there a forward slash and we're not at the home page? Okay, then basically recursively call this function and remove the first character there. So remove that forward slash. That's just in case you have multiple forward slashes there. Now, if there isn't a forward slash, then just return the URI as it is. Then we have another function here to make it root relative. So in case we have a content source that wants to be root relative, so this would often happen if you're in your main file here. So if you're looking in like your Plenti.json config file, so if you made your website's root relative by doing path overrides like this instead of just doing it like this, then we want that to work still. So basically we went through and we made sure that we checked those root relative URLs as well. And then we just go through and we do a content lookup on each one of those. So we do this operator here, which basically says if this is not undefined, then go on to the next one. Or if this is undefined, then check to the next one. If it's not, if it gives us a value, then just use this value. So we do a content lookup on the URI that's passed. Then we make sure that the relative URIs, if that's not found, is the relative URI found. If that's not found, is the root relative one found, and then is the regular URI with a trailing slash found. If that's not, then is a relative URI with a trailing slash, and it does all those different combinations just to make sure we can account for all those different combinations that people want to do. So basically, if you're using an old Plenti site and you have all root relative URIs, they should still work. That shouldn't break the site, but it should now allow you to go through and do base URL things if you want to do that. You can make your whole site relative based off that stuff, and you can see the router's been adjusted as well. So we use the get content from here as well. And we have these two new magic props. So there's local and base URL, although I think I might combine these into one JavaScript object like environment, env or something like that, to basically have less namespaced props, magic props. But basically those are now something that you can use to go and change your head file. So you can do something like this. You can say, okay, are we on a local site? Then make sure our base element is set to /. If not, then use the base URL that is defined in our Plenti.json. So you can optionally define a base URL attribute over here. So let's just take a look at doing that real quick. So we have base URL test. If I save that, come back over here and reload this and come back and reload our site. Oh, well, one thing that's happening here, you'll notice here, the reason this is not coming through, even though we have a base URL, if you look in your nav, in your head, it's going to look for local, and local is being set to true in this case because we're on our local web server. So if you want to just see what this would look like, you could just manually set this to false. So now this is the base is getting assigned to this /. This base URL that's coming from our config, and that's getting put into this base element here. So this will break the site because our files are not being served off that path. But if you come over here, it should look like a site without any styles. Reload this, okay? So if you look down in the bottom left-hand corner, you see that's now going to test about and test contact where we have those relative URLs. So that would work with your deployed site. So that should all be good. And that's basically how the base URLs work at a high level. We had to change a lot of our content source information. So if you were to actually take a look through here and inspect your element and look at your network, reload this. Although we might want to actually change this since we're breaking a lot of this stuff here. Let's come back here and undo this. Let's get our local working again. Let's reload this. And okay. So if we looked into our content.js file here, and let's just put this in here, you'll see now that these by default are not getting / added to them. So everything is relative by default unless you manually override that content. So it should give you a little more flexibility. Another thing to keep in mind is if you're on internal pages and you want to navigate back and you want them to be relative, so you want them to work with your base URL, you're going to want to change the href here to use a dot notation. So normally you would just code this like a /, right? Now either one of these will work. You can / back to the home page. Just keep in mind if you're using a /, it will not work with your base URL if you have a subfolder. So if you're not trying to serve this off a subfolder on GitHub pages or GitLab pages, it's not anything you really need to worry about. Just code your websites exactly like normal. But if you want to use those, then go back to your index page with dots and make sure all your URLs are relative. So like things like about page, do not do / about, just do about because they'll work off of your base element that's automatically getting injected into your head here, as long as you've started with the newer version of Plenti that we're releasing soon. So yeah, that's all there is to it. Any questions? All right, cool.